You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have joining us, and thankfully so today, Clare Lopez. And I got to tell you, they do great work, but she's the Vice President of Research and Analysis with the Center for Security Policy. And Clare, well, first of all, thank you so much for joining John and I in the Final Say. But
thanks for having me. Glad to be with you.
Could you imagine a situation where we could talk about 20 different issues right now? I mean, where do we even start? But obviously there's two or three that we need to go right to. And I've never imagined times like this where the news cycle from day to day, it's like so fluid that you can't even plan because of the thing, because every day there's 3 or 4 new things that you have to jump right into. So immediately, if we could, I'm very surprised that the president has finally decided after 5.5 years to act on Afghanistan. And now we could argue whether he's doing the right thing or not, but I guess from my standpoint and John's, there are a lot of innocent people that have helped us in the past, meaning the Kurds and the related groups and Christian people who are being slaughtered. And I guess from a human standpoint, we have to try to help these people from what has become just a sickening group, the ISIS or ISIL, whatever we want to refer to them. They call themselves the Islamic State. I prefer not to give them that much credit. But this is like really unbelievable. And so I'm glad the president is doing something. And I guess we could argue if we're doing the right thing or if we're doing enough. I'm sure you have much to say on that.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think you're referring to Iraq here. And obviously news broke last night that the president was speaking from the White House, where he authorized the United States military to conduct both air strikes against IS, and I do call them IS because that's what they call themselves, the Islamic State or the Caliphate, and those strikes were carried out from planes launched from the USS George W. Bush aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, and they were launched against IS artillery positions which were firing upon Kurdish forces which hold the city, very key northern Iraqi city of Erbil, where, by the way, the U.S. has a consulate also. But the other thing that really, I think, brought the U.S. into this conflict right now was the horrific humanitarian disaster unfolding in a region called Sinjar province. It's a province in the north of Iraq, near the border with Syria, and it's a part of what is called the Nineveh Plain, a very ancient part of old Mesopotamia, and where some of the very first and the oldest of all Christian communities have lived for hundreds of years. The Assyrians, the Chaldeans, Christians all, as well as other minorities like the Yazidis. Yazidis are monotheistic, believe in one true God, but they predate both Christianity and Islam, go back maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years. Anyway, as ISIS has plowed through a lot of territory in both Syria and Iraq over the last couple of months, it has engaged in some of the most horrific atrocities against the people in these regions, including beheadings and crucifixions, and including beheadings of children, the sexual enslavement of women, wholesale slaughter of POWs, execution style of POWs, Iraqi soldiers whom they've captured. In any case, a large number, maybe as many as 40,000 Christians and Yazidis fled from the town of Sinjar that was overrun by these forces, and they fled up a mountain. But up that mountain, they've got nothing. There's no food, no water. They didn't take anything with them. They fled with the clothes on their backs. They're stuck up there now. No food, no water. People are dying. Children are dying. And the access roads to this place are all cut off by ISIS. And so this was really the immediate, urgent necessity that brought the White House, President Obama, finally to the decision he made last night to attack the IS positions, but also to conduct airdrops with C-130, C-17 cargo planes to drop pallets of food and water and other supplies to these isolated people up on the mountaintop there.
Yeah, and that's thank you for all that information. That's a great detail of what is going on there. And I want to bring up this because we have had boots on, he mentioned we're not going to put boots on the ground, but we have had boots on the ground. We've had a certain amount of advisors. We don't know the exact number, but it's in the hundreds. Certainly, I don't know, it could be 400, it could be 500. It's hard to tell from the accounts, and we shouldn't necessarily be giving that number out anyway, so the enemy doesn't know what forces we actually have available. But I do think it's important to understand that if we are doing strategic bombing of some sorts, I would imagine that we're going to utilize some of these forces to help find and locate the targets and possibly have to mark them for the
I do think you're right about that for sure. The media itself has widely figures upwards of 700,000 U.S. advisors in Iraq right now, mostly in Baghdad, but they've also published a number of around 40 in the city of Erbil. Remember this Kurdish city we mentioned earlier that IS forces are besieging or attacking, moving on in any case. And the media have published a figure of about 40 U.S. advisors, who are probably special forces and probably helped to call in some of those airstrikes.
Oh, sure. And, so I guess one question would be, is 40 enough to protect our interests there? And I guess on a complete side note, it's certainly something to think about. After the lessons of the catastrophe in Benghazi, I suppose we don't want to repeat that. Not we, meaning this administration and the people who are responsible for protecting that consulate.
Yeah, well, I think you're bringing up a very good sort of underlying point here, and that is, what are America's national strategic interests in Iraq right now? Obviously, the president decided to pull most American forces out of Iraq. He's done that. That pretty much opened the door for Iraq to become a puppet, the Baghdad regime of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, to become a puppet of the Shiite Iranian regime in Tehran. ISIS, of course, being primarily Sunni, is now the attacking force here, attacking both the Iranian-backed regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and Damascus, but now also the Nouri al-Maliki puppet regime of Iran in Baghdad. So what are America's real compelling national interests? Well, I can certainly understand the compelling need to provide humanitarian aid to these as many as 40,000, they're saying, people stuck up on top of this mountain and facing certain death from hunger and thirst if we don't airdrop them supplies, or to be killed if they descended the mountain and met the IS forces at the bottom of the mountain. But the broader issue, in Iraq, what are our interests? Well, our interests, I think, first and foremost, you rightly pointed out exactly, are taking care of our people. We have an embassy in Baghdad, and we have consulates in Basra, which is in the Shiite area in the south and not under threat right now, and up in Erbil, this Kurdish city in the north. So taking care of them and evacuating them if need be, not defending the city of Erbil or the city of Basra, if it came to that, against attacking forces. That's not our job. If need be, we need to pull those people out of there. But for right now, they need to be protected. But secondly, then, what are our longer-term national strategic interests in this part of the world? Well, what's going on in Syria and Iraq is an intra-Islamic, internal sectarian fight between Shiites and Sunnis. America's got no dog in that fight. When the Iranian jihadis, and that's what they are, it's a jihadist regime in Tehran, Shiites face off with their allies, Hezbollah and Syria, against a bunch of Sunni jihadis led by al-Qaeda forces, including Muslim Brotherhood forces, equally jihadis, backed by jihadist regimes in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, we don't necessarily want to assist or degrade the capabilities of either side. We don't want to see either one win. Back to Kissinger and the Iran-Iraq war of the 80s. Why can't they both lose? Our interests are our people first, and then our friends and allies in the region. The countries of Israel, first and foremost, of course, Jordan also, Saudi Arabia because of the oil fields, keeping open the shipping lanes. These are our core national security interests. I also think that we have long been remiss in not reaching out to communities, the oldest indigenous communities of these regions, Kurds, Baha'is in Iran, Copts in Egypt. These are the indigenous people of these regions. Not reaching out to them as natural allies of the West and of the United States. We've been remiss in that. That is a mistake, and we're still not really correcting that. The Kurds, for instance, are the largest national community on the face of the earth that have never had their own country. They are now holding together a contiguous territory spanning between Syria and Iraq that they would like to hold on to for their own, an autonomous region. They're Muslims, but they're not jihadis. And that, by the way, is the dividing line in terms of Islam and of Muslims. Are you jihadi or are you not jihadi? Are you a Muslim by culture and simply prayer and devotion and worship? Or are you a Muslim that obeys the commandments of doctrine, law, and scripture, the Quran, and so forth, and are you a jihadi? That's the difference. The Kurds are not jihadis. So these are the considerations that I would mention in terms of U.S. Strategic interests in these regions.
Now, Claire, you've done a brilliant analysis, and of course, we are huge fans of the Center for Security Policy for that very reason, because they look at this from a very high-level strategic as well as a tactical perspective, and have, perhaps one of the most sober and long-term appreciations for the underlying clash of civilizations that we're facing. And I assume you may have seen Netanyahu had a great interview with Sean Hannity. In fact, I thought it was some of Hannity's best work. And Netanyahu was so simple and so clear in his representation of Israel basically fighting on the front lines for the entire West. This is not just about Gaza. This is about radical Islamists versus Western liberalized democracies and pluralist societies. So with that in mind, I'm curious, with your background in intelligence, do we have adequate resources in the intelligence community to help identify the appropriate threats that we're facing? And then along those lines, are those same resources, if applied properly, do they have enough access to different levels of government to be effective? In other words, if POTUS decides that he is going to stand in the way of intelligence being affected upon, is the intelligence community's relationship directly with Congress, for example, strong enough to maybe circumvent that, at least bring it to the public eye?
Well, the core issue here, really good question, and that is, are our intelligence community agencies capable of understanding and meeting and effectively fighting back against this challenge? And this challenge, as Prime Minister Netanyahu articulated in that wonderful interview that, yes, I did see last night with Sean Hannity, that challenge is the enemy forces of Islamic Jihad. That is what we're facing, a resurgent Islamic Jihad. These are not Islamists. It's not Islamism. They're not radical. They're not extreme. This is plain old, simple, authoritative, normative, up-the-middle Islam, resurgent as jihad. And the reason that happened, I think now, beginning in the 20th century, a confluence of events, including the end of the colonial period, the end of the world wars, which convulsed the world for a great part of the 20th century, the end of the Cold War, the discovery of oil that funded it all, and then the rise of the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1928, and the takeover of Iran by Shiite jihadis, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. All of this enabled the resurgence of Islamic jihad, which in fact is simply the pattern of history going back 1,300 years. The 20th century was an interruption in that, if you will, because of all those factors I just named, the world wars and colonialism and all of that. That lid has come off now, and so we're reverting to what is just the natural course of events in Islamic history, and that is jihad. That is what we're facing. Yes, Israel stands on the front lines. If you look at a map, look at little tiny Israel with 7 million Jews population, and between them, they stand between massive Arab Islamic world and Europe. Europe, which, by the way, has been repeatedly invaded by the forces of Islamic Jihad over history, but a lot of people forget about that. And Israel is what stands between. Do our intelligence community agencies have the capability to understand this, to face this, to effectively counter it? In a word, no. Our intelligence community is broken. It is completely and badly infiltrated by the forces of the Muslim Brotherhood, which are its closest advisors and trainers now, especially during the last several years, but beginning even before that. They are not allowed, literally, are not allowed to learn about Islamic doctrine, law, and scripture as the animating ideology of Islamic terrorism. The words I've just spoken are not permitted even to be spoken inside of the intelligence community of the United States today. So, no, are they capable? No, it is a catastrophic failure, to cite the upcoming title of a book by our colleague and CSP fellow Stephen Coughlin. Catastrophic failure of professional responsibility, dereliction of duty, anything you like to call it. But no, they are completely incapable of facing this threat.
Now, what you just painted was really a pretty scary scenario, something along the lines, not just the normative nature of Islam, but the fact that what we have is akin to Roosevelt bringing the SS officers into Washington to help explain the Jewish problem back in 1939 to 45. And
well, so I would actually take it another way. It's the Roosevelt administration bringing in communist spies and influence operators, agents of influence of the Stalin regime in the Soviet Union, which is exactly what he did. That's the analogy.
I accept your correction for the record. So
no, but your analogy works too. But I'm just saying this is the one that actually happened.
You're right. It's true, and it did. Here's the concern I have. We have a clear problem with America sacrificing the moral high ground, and with that, and you were pointing this out in your strategic approach, we also need to have not just the moral high ground, but the strategic high ground. And it seems to me that the way you do that is you identify the most critical choke points, like protecting the access points to the Gulf, which of course mean any oil field, which of course means Saudi Arabia has to be a high priority, even though they're an odd frenemy. But there's two countries that concern me the most I wanted you to touch on. One is Turkey. I believe Turkey has crossed the line and pretty much should be tossed out of NATO. The other one I want you to discuss in this overall equation is Qatar, which, as you know, is building one of the most, if not the most advanced military naval bases. They are the purveyors of propaganda now on American TV, and worst of all, they are the central bankers of much of the negative of what's going on in terrorism, but you would think that they're Obama's BFFs.
Well, you're absolutely right, I think, to be concerned about these two countries who ostensibly are supposed to be U.S. allies. Of course, Qatar, home to a couple of very large U.S. military bases. Turkey, as you mentioned, a member of NATO. But both of these countries were, at least originally, backers and supporters and financiers and enablers of jihadist forces, which in the beginning, 2011, took up arms, the rebellion against Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, in Syria. Turkey has allowed its territory to be used by IS terror training camps and transit camps where fighters coming in, let's say, from elsewhere in the world, pass through these Turkish IS terror training camps on their way to the battlefields in Syria. But then you look at the United States, and what have we done? We had special forces in Jordan. I wonder if they're still there, training Syrian fighters who later turned out to be IS members. So I mean, we're all in a muddle about this. Turkey now is apparently engaged in a sort of a rapprochement with its Kurdish population, and even with the Turkish Kurdish terror organization, the PKK, but also working with Kurds elsewhere in the region, for instance, Syria even, and Iraq. In Iraq, the Kurdish region of the northern part of Iraq is where a lot of the oil is. And Turkey has made deals with that Kurdish population to buy its oil from Iraqi Kurds. So if this sounds confusing, it's because it is. It really is a muddle, but I think your term frenemy was the perfect one to use in regards to both Turkey and Qatar. Qatar, of course, home away from home for the Muslim Brotherhood, a jihadist organization, outlawed, by the way, now in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood scared them straight because they saw threats to their own regime. But Qatar, the place that still backs and supports and finances jihad all over the place, but the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, it's where the senior cleric, the senior jurist of the Muslim Brotherhood, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, has made his home since being exiled out of Egypt decades ago. It's where Al Jazeera broadcasts from, Doha. And so no friend of the United States, and yet there's an element there that we're not willing to give up because we've got these two huge military bases in Qatar. So things in a real muddle. But I think the bottom line I would make under all of this is that the U.S. lacks a true strategy, lacks an actual understanding and strategic plan for what is our core, compelling national security interest in the region and vis-a-vis each one of these various players, countries, and groups.
That's an excellent point. Well, there's a lot I'd like to say here. Do you have a little more time with us?
Sure, if you do. All right.
Okay, terrific. We've had you long. I just didn't want to, in case you had something else. First, I want to go back to the beginning statement that you made. You know, Herbert Hoover had a lot of memoirs that the Hoover Institute had put out it was like a 900-plus page book that I actually have a copy of. And he spoke at great length of the communist influence for many decades, but in particular, he had mentioned exactly what you said through the FDR's administration. And it did have a significant impact going forward. And what we see in recent administrations is a similar thing with the Muslim Brotherhood and other, Arab representatives, if you will, in infiltrating, I think, significant parts of our government and influencing whatever policy, whatever you want to term what we have. I agree. I don't think we have a coherent policy, but whatever it is, it's being influenced. And I would say this, in addition to the problem of not having a clear or thoughtful policy, I think the fact that it changes so significantly from administration to administration is even more dangerous, because basically, I mean, it almost seems to me, Bush might not have been perfect, but it seems to me that Barack Obama came into office and decided that whatever Bush did, I'm doing the opposite, whether it was good or bad. And that's no way to go into policy.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, the trouble we're in today has to do with a failure to understand, to know the enemy, and then on that basis to formulate and implement an effective strategy to defeat that enemy. Unfortunately, the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood into the top levels of our national security government agencies, cabinet departments, etc., began a long time ago, literally decades ago. But it really gained ground during the Clinton administration of the 1990s and partly because the Clinton administration simply was unaware. Occupied elsewhere, pizza parties, Monica Lewinsky, who knows? Then the Muslim Brotherhood pivoted on a dime very adroitly and began to support the Republican conservative political elements in this country when it seemed clear that Republicans would win the White House in the year 2000, at which they did, and then immediately very closely followed thereafter, of course, taking office, Bush administration taking office by 9/11. And so he is, of course, consumed with that and the aftermath of that. But his administration then was deeply, badly penetrated by the Muslim Brotherhood, only he didn't know it. Clinton didn't know it. Bush didn't know it. Is that an excuse? No, it's not an excuse. It's their professional responsibility to know these things, but it wasn't deliberate. They didn't know that they were penetrated.
Well,
but then along comes the Obama administration, which yes. I was just going to say, according kind of what you said before, and that is they deliberately and knowingly allied themselves with the Muslim Brotherhood, knowing perfectly well who they are.
I mentioned earlier in the program the speech in Cairo. They sat him in the front row.
Well, at that speech, yeah, in Cairo, exactly, in 2009. So, in any case, I think that this administration is quite a bit different than the ones before it in the extent and the acceleration of the penetration by the Muslim Brotherhood, but also in the knowing, deliberate willingness to work with the Brotherhood, understanding perfectly well who they are and what their objectives are, which are anti-constitutional, quite frankly.
Yes. Claire, this is a pretty touchy subject, and I think the alliances in the Middle East, regardless of the United States, are sort of falling in the line, and it seems to me that current state Egypt with the al-Sisi government and Saudi Arabia seem to be have a lot in common, and then on the other hand, it seems that you have the Qatar, Turkey, Iran contingency, but I think Jordan right now is being misunderstood, and I think there's two issues there. One is you do have a Muslim Brotherhood influence in Jordan, and then I guess the question would be, to your knowledge, who's in charge there? Is it the military that's in charge? Does the king really have as much power as he used to? And who's pulling the strings there? And should we be conscious of the relationship we have with Jordan right now, as should the Israelis?
Yeah, well, you and the Israelis and we are all right to be seriously concerned about the future of Jordan. For now, the Hashemite monarchy of King Abdullah is firmly in control. They have taken in, though, a huge number of Syrian refugees, the overwhelming numbers of which are anti-Assad, which makes them probably pro-Brotherhood. And that is on top of an existing, quote-unquote, refugee population of Palestinians dating back to the 1967 war with Israel. So the original Jordanian population, which is Bedouin, is vastly outnumbered by these more recent arrivals. The Hashemites themselves, one might say, are rather more recent arrivals, although back in the 20th century when the great-grandfather of the current King Abdullah lost out in his struggle to hang on as what they called him, the Sharif of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, when Ibn Saud, another jihadist, took over that eventual country and oil spigot. And as a consolation prize, the British gave the Hashemite clan family Jordan to rule. They could do that back in those days. And so they themselves are not native to Jordan. The Hashemite kingdom of Abdullah, regime of Abdullah. But they are holding on. And the other thing to note is that they are finding new alliances with Israel. Israel, of course, looks to its eastern border with Jordan, across Judea and Samaria, that is, and agree that, ISIS is a serious threat. On top of the economic burden of all these refugees, now ISIS knocking at Jordan's, that would be its eastern border with Iraq, and so Israel is deeply concerned, as are we, and I think the strategic interest of both of us would be to help the Jordanian King Abdullah to hold the line, if it came to that, against ISIS, hold the line in Jordan.
Yeah, that's a very interesting and fascinating analysis, and it is. I think the Middle East right now is as complex a region as we have had to deal with in a very long time. Claire, I want to mention this. Last year, John and I went with Frank Gaffney and the group to Israel and on the fact-finding mission, and it was just an incredible experience, and we learned so much and met so many very interesting and really amazing people who have contributed a lot to this nation. We're going to go back again this year. I know Frank is going. I'm sure that others from the center are going as well. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to be going in a time where things are just worse in the region. It's going to be just very interesting. But I wanted to mention it because I think anyone listening out there who is able to go on that type of a trip should certainly go and find out more information about that. But I just want to say this. You guys do, and I know John said it earlier, but you guys do an incredible job. You do a great service for your nation, and the information that you guys bring to the table is just really, it's above and beyond what anyone else is doing today, and I just wanted to thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that, and don't underestimate the role that radio shows like yours play in giving us an opportunity to speak, to all of your listeners. And yes, if anyone is interested in more information about the center, about the trip, we're at www.centerforsecuritypolicy.org, and you'll find all of that and more, our publications, the radio broadcast that our founder and president, Frank Gaffney, does daily, Secure Freedom Radio, lots of resources, and thanks so much for highlighting that. But thank you, too, for giving us an opportunity to reach your listeners through your program.
Well, thank you, Claire. And Clare Lopez, thank you so much again. And you have yourself a great weekend, and we will speak with you soon. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.